Thank you, Sarah.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully there's no issue. Yeah, thank you so much for that introduction. And so we are going to be talking about recognizing unhealthy relationships and finding support. I am the senior community advocate at the second step, and Lauren is presenting with me as well.
Yes, and I'm also an advocate at the second step. And thank you everyone so much for being here tonight.
Yeah. So just to start off, we want to kind of just give a brief overview of what abuse is, what domestic violence looks like. So a general definition is it's a pattern of behavior that one person uses to gain, maintain power and control over another person. It's really broad and kind of purposefully. There's a lot of misconception of what abuse looks like, often that it's only physical, and we still kind of abide by that in a lot of policy and a lot of social understanding of abuse. So it's kept general because we want to understand it in a grand scheme of things. So that kind of brings me to my next point of the types of abuse. So these are, and there's many different variations within this, but just to start, physical, like I said, that's probably the most commonly understood. But there's also emotional, verbal, and psychological abuse. We usually combine these because there's a lot of overlapping red flags or behaviors within these. So this looks like belittling, insulting someone, manipulating, or gaslighting. There's also sexual abuse, which in turn goes with physical. Financial abuse, which is very common and probably one of the most misunderstood and not spoken about forms of abuse. Cultural and spiritual, which really focus around someone's cultural identity. This may look like an abuser not allowing someone to go to their place of worship or practice their own cultural practices. Another one, which is more new age, and we're still learning how to safety plan accordingly with it, is digital and technological abuse. This looks like a lot of monitoring online, hacking, changing of passwords, or pretending to be someone online, their partner. And the last one is identity abuse. This is commonly seen within the LGBTQ community. And it could be, abusing someone based on their gender identity, sexual orientation, etc. So this is just a brief overview of what those forms of abuse may look like in a few examples. Now, just kind of understanding what abuse looks like, what this pattern of behavior looks like. It used to kind of be understood as a cycle of abuse, but we've changed that to now be called the wave of abuse. And it's because a cycle, it didn't always represent that. It wasn't always this perfect circle of going back around. A wave is better to kind of explain the way that the behavior goes. So to begin, it's a honeymoon stage. A lot of people think that, abusers come in and they're these aggressive, people. But the reality is that if people showed their abusive tendencies from the get-go, most people wouldn't get in relationships with them. It often starts with a honeymoon phase. This looks like love bombing or showering someone with immense affection, admiration in a really short period of time. The key is that it's very fast and intense very quickly and early on. And, there might be this gut feeling in the survivor, but, if they've ever experienced something like someone showering them presence and adoration, they might think this is amazing. This is what love is meant to be. So this is this honeymoon phase. And gradually tensions start to build. There's arguments, there's maybe monitoring. Maybe you go to a friend's house and someone's texting you saying, who's there? Who are you with? I just want to make sure you're safe. And it comes across as this concerned, caring kind of behavior, but it starts to get more and more intense. All of a sudden, the people that are there, they're not okay with them being there. You come home and there's arguments to be had of where you were. This begins to increase and increase where you might find yourself refraining from telling who you're with or canceling plans so you can avoid conflict. You're starting to change behavior and how you present, kind of walking on eggshells is what it's commonly called. And there's an incident. This looks like the abusive incident. This could look physical, emotional, verbal, any of those forms that we had previously discussed. And this is a large incident where usually the survivor feels very afraid and threatened, and the abuser is taking control and inserting their power over them. After this is the apology, the hearts and flowers. I'm so sorry. a lot of excuses, a lot of deflecting, I'll never do that again. I was drunk, those kinds of things, really deflecting responsibility of what just happened. And then you go back, and the same old stuff is kind of a broad generalization, because the reality is that now there's a new set of rules. You're not necessarily going back to this honeymoon phase. You're going to now a new baseline of new rules, new expectations. You learned, okay, I can't go to my friend's house because they're going to get mad. So now I just don't see my friends that often. That's the new baseline that you're operating at. And then it builds again. And then this is that kind of cycle that we often see, and it continues on from there. A lot of information, but I think this is a good picture that just helps people understand why it is so difficult to get out of these abusive relationships and even recognize it's happening, because it's not black and white. It's very complex and it's up and down. And now I'm going to pass it on to Lauren.
Thank you. So kind of considering who was impacted by domestic violence, if there's one point that we really want to get across today, it's that domestic violence can unfortunately impact everyone, regardless of their identities. So regardless of gender, sexuality, race, size, ability, age, and more. As Gabby kind of touched on before, there are these stereotypes in society about maybe what an abuser looks like, what a survivor looks like. And I hope that some of these statistics can kind of show that this is an issue that touches everyone. I'm not going to go through and read every one of these. You can read them to yourselves, but one that I really want to highlight at the bottom is that 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men experience domestic violence in their lifetimes. And this number is the same or higher for gender diverse individuals. I think a lot of times we hear folks say, I believe that domestic violence happens. I know that it's a problem, but it just doesn't happen here. It doesn't happen to anyone I know. It doesn't happen in my neighborhood, my community. And unfortunately, it probably is. You probably do know someone who's been impacted by this issue if it's 1 in 4 and 1 in 7. And to really kind of highlight that, I want to share a statistic about our community in Massachusetts that isn't on this slide. So last year, in the year of 2021, there were 15 domestic violence homicides in the state of Massachusetts. So it is happening to our neighbors in our community. That's not 15 people who are experiencing domestic violence generally statewide. That's people who lost their lives in 1 year alone. So now I'm going to share some myths and facts. As Gabby mentioned earlier, there is this common misperception, even amongst most of the survivors that we serve, that domestic violence is only physical. We really typically hear this from survivors who think that maybe their experiences aren't valid, they aren't actually experiencing domestic violence, or maybe they think that they don't deserve help or qualify for our services because their abuse is not physical. In reality, there are many other types of abuse besides physical abuse that Gabby shared earlier. And these forms can not only be more common, like psychological and verbal, but they can actually have really long-lasting impacts. We often hear survivors say, my physical injuries healed, but those psychological and verbal things that were said to me have stuck with me for years. Our next myth is that only women experience domestic violence and only men are abusers. Again, although statistically it is true that women experience domestic violence at higher rates than men, 1 in 7 men also experience domestic violence. And it is likely that the statistic is actually very underreported due to societal expectations and beliefs about gender, right? If you're hearing that men can't be abused and that's not possible, it's going to make it a lot harder to come forward and say, I am being abused and I do need help. There's also a lack of appropriate resources for male survivors, which makes it even harder to come forward. So it is unfortunately estimated that 1 in 7 statistic for men is even much higher. Our next myth is that if a survivor chooses to stay in their relationship, the abuse must not be that bad. This is far from the truth. Leaving has actually been shown to be the most dangerous time for survivors, high rates of violence. And there's many reasons why people might not leave these relationships, one being fear of the unknown. Maybe they've been with the abuser for a long time and they don't know what it'll be like when that relationship ends. They might have a lack of resources if they leave. Often survivors are cut off financially and socially. They might have threats of harm from their abuser, either to the survivor or children or pets. So it can be very challenging to leave these relationships, and that doesn't say anything about the severity of the situation. Our next myth is that domestic violence is an anger control issue. This is not true. Our fact is that abusers act deliberately and with forethought, and they are in control of their actions. A good example of this is that abusers do not treat their boss the same way as they treat their partner. Folks who are perpetrating domestic violence are very much in control of their actions. They can choose who they lash out to, and anger is a tool that they're using to get what they want or come up with an excuse. And our last myth is that children aren't aware of the violence going on in their homes. And this one can be really hard for people to come to terms with, especially survivors. No one wants to, face the fact that their children are experiencing pain or traumatic events. But when it comes down to it, studies do show that most children are aware of the violence in their homes. And it's really important to address this violence with them in an age-appropriate way, but in a way where they don't feel like they are being invalidated, or maybe that it's being brushed under the rug or people are pretending that it's not happening. Addressing it with them in a straightforward way and helping them get the care that they need is much more beneficial and long-term for children. So moving on to our next slide, we're often asked what warning signs might be for either people's own relationships or in the community. How can I notice that this is happening around me? So some of these signs might be ones that you would notice in your own relationship, and some of these are going to be geared more towards warning signs you might be able to pick up in others. Starting with our first one, it's extreme jealousy and possessiveness. So this might look like jealousy of past relationships, or time spent away from the partner with friends or family, or this fear that the partner will meet someone else at work or school or an environment where the abuser is not present, or accusations of cheating or an affair. Our second warning sign is increased social isolation. So this can look like trying to cut the partner off from family or friends, or limiting time spent with those folks without the abuser also present. Accusations about family and friends causing trouble or interfering with the relationship. And it can also look like a survivor becoming more reserved or distant socially. Our third warning sign is frequent, unexplained, or underexplained injuries. So this might look like, it's pretty self-explanatory, a survivor presenting with more frequent injuries than they did before getting into this relationship, or injuries that are kind of more severe or inconsistent with their explanation. Maybe someone has full body bruising and you ask what happens and they say that they tripped on the curb, and that sounds a little suspicious. Our fourth warning sign is frequent excuses for the partner's actions. So this could look like the survivor constantly needing to justify their partner's actions. This might look like they only hit me once, they won't do it again. They yell at me because their job is stressful. Or kind of related to our fifth warning sign, the survivor might think that they deserve what happens to them. So, oh, well, I was being annoying, so I deserve that abuse. And that could also be an excuse. That leads us into our fifth, decreased self-esteem. The survivor might become increasingly and unnecessarily apologetic, make more negative statements about themselves, or believe that they deserve what happens to them. And again, that can be in the context of the abusive relationship, but also in general. Maybe they, they're in a parking lot and someone bumps into their car. They might spiral and think, I deserve this. I'm a bad driver. It's all my fault. I'm such a screw up, even though that's kind of not a warranted reaction in that situation where someone else is hitting your car, right? But it's just that pattern, that mindset that survivors get into. And our final warning sign that's on this slide, I'd say this is probably the most overarching one that's on this slide, or the most common one that we see, is controlling behaviors. So that can look like basically anything that limits the survivor's own decision-making capacity. The abuser might be controlling aspects of the survivor's appearance, socialization, decision-making. That could be about their education, their work, their use of technology. And this is often disguised as care or concern for the survivor. I think Gabby gave a good example of that earlier. Like, I just am checking in because I love you and I care about you and I want you to do well. And there's a couple other common ones. Obviously, there's many warning signs within relationships and that you might notice in others. It's hard to fit them all into one slide, but there's a couple more common ones to look out for that I just want to highlight, including cruelty to animals, destroying or disrespecting the survivor's belongings, and unrealistic expectations for the partner's behavior, such as expecting them to be perfect or meet every need or be their entire world. So I'm going to pass it back on to Gabriella.
Thank you. So now kind of switching gears, and Lauren did a good transition of that we've talked a lot about just framing what domestic violence looks like, especially for the survivor experiencing it. This is now more so for people that want to support those in their life about, that may be experiencing domestic violence. And there are do's and don'ts. There's good ways to support and not great ways to support. So we're just going to briefly go over some of those. So some do's are checking in at a safe time and place. It's important to note that not any time is the right time to check in with someone if they're experiencing violence. You don't know if there's monitoring going on, if someone's checking their calls or their text messages. So be just mindful about when you're checking in. Also, take time to listen and believe what they say. You're not a police officer, you're not a judge, you're there as a support system, as a friend or a family member who's just concerned, and you're just there to give them space and speak. Of course, express concern for their well-being. This goes hand in hand, like I said before. Offer helpful resources. We're not saying you can't offer anything and you just sit there, but be mindful of the resources you're giving. If someone's telling you something traumatic or that they're experiencing, you don't have to say, call 911 right now. If they're not ready for that, you can say, oh, I went to this webinar and I learned about this and they shared these resources. Maybe this could be helpful. That's a more gentle way of sharing that, just saying, I'm thinking of you and I think this would help, rather than placing an expectation. Also, respect their choices. The hardest thing about domestic violence is that we cannot control other people's decisions. And the more we try to do that, the more we're going to push them away. And then they won't feel comfortable opening up for help. So we do have to respect their choices. They might not make the decisions we think they should, but that's not our job. Remind them that it isn't their fault. This sounds pretty like common sense, but the reality is that they may not have heard that ever. You might be the first person that is saying to them, you didn't deserve this. You didn't do anything wrong. Because like Lauren had said, usually abusers operate in blaming, and survivors think that they have done something wrong or they deserve it or they need to change something about themselves and it'll get better. But you just saying this isn't your fault, you didn't do anything wrong, can be really groundbreaking for survivors. And be patient. Like I said, there isn't a time frame on this. Unfortunately, as much as we want to help people and get them out of ASAP, we have to be patient. And it's not just one factor, it's 1,000. And a lot of those have to line up. And then some don'ts. These ones are big. So everybody wants to help, and it doesn't always come across in a helpful way. So don't feel the need to be an expert. That is why we exist. These agencies exist to support survivors, and we're professionally trained with years of experience. So it's okay to lean on us. It's okay to say, I don't know all the answers, but these people do. You should reach out to them. That's super helpful. Obviously, don't judge and blame them. They're already feeling that internally. Trust me, that's the shame that they feel and keeps them pretty frozen. So you projecting that on them is not going to help. Don't set ultimatums. Again, it's the time frame. They have to make those decisions on their own, and this can put a lot of pressure on people and just makes them kind of freeze and feel like they can't do anything. Pressuring them to make decisions similarly. You don't have to provide counseling or advice. Like I said, there's professionals there. You don't have to be their therapist, be their friend, be their, sister, brother, parent, whoever you are. You don't have to be a professional role. And lastly, and probably the most important, don't mediate between survivors and abusers. This is super unsafe for all parties. You don't know the situation. It can just cause a lot of unsafe communication. And also then you kind of have now told the abuser that the survivor has spoken to you about what's going on. And that can cause a really unsafe situation. And second to this, because that was a lot of information, these are just the key messages. Like, it doesn't even have to be that complex. It's as simple as this, as just saying these things to survivors. If someone's coming to you and you're just like, I don't know what advice to give, I don't know what to say, this is all you have to say. I believe you. It's not your fault. You're not alone. I'm here for you. Help is available. Thank you for telling me. These are groundbreaking things to say to survivors because usually they have not heard these ever or in a very long time. So it can be as simple as this. You're just offering them the space. Thank you, and I will share this. Now send it to Lauren.
Thank you. Yeah, and as Gabby just shared, you're not alone. There are many organizations, some of which are represented here tonight in the area that this is, all we do all week, all year. So, a list of those is going to go out with more details. So like the names of organizations locally, how to get in touch with them, all of that is going to be sent to folks who signed up for this webinar via email by the end of this week. But this is kind of generally what you could expect if you get in touch with those organizations. So these are just examples of services that we provide. Not every organization has every one of these services, but we are all pretty linked in with each other. So if you do call one of our organizations and we don't have, say you're looking for emergency shelter, and that's not something that our organization offers, we're happy to help refer you to one that does have that. So just reviewing what's generally offered, we have safety planning, support groups, advocacy, limited financial assistance in some cases, emergency and transitional shelter, referrals, that's not just to other domestic and sexual violence organizations in the area, that can also be to many different types of resources, legal help, and counseling. But in the center, we have support. As Gabby said, you're not alone in this, whether you personally are experiencing domestic violence or if you just want to call someone to check in. Maybe you're concerned about someone that you know and you want to talk to someone more about those warning signs you're noticing. That is what we're here for. So again, additional resources and contact information for these organizations will be shared with you all. Some are shared in the chat right now, and the rest will be shared via email. But if it is an emergency, always call 911 first. Most of these are not going to be able to respond as quickly as emergency responders would, but we are here to support surrounding domestic violence. So yeah, that is the end of our presentation. We really appreciate you all being here. And I think now we're going to switch over to our panel.